So an establishment year, across the board, productivity dropped hugely, like from 14 down to 9 or thereabouts ton. By year 2, boom, back up, straight back up. Grass swards growing just over 14 ton, 225 kilos of chemical in. Clover swards growing the same, in around 85, I think it was, kilos, 90 kilos chemical in. Year 3, or so second full year production, trend is very similar. They're doing the business in terms of growing the tonnage with, 150 kilos less nitrogen.
Hello, I'm James Dunne, and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights, and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. Maintaining farm productivity and profitability is always top of a farmer's agenda, but doing that in a reducing chemical N environment is challenging and requires the successful incorporation of clover within our grazed pastures. I'm joined by Teagasc grassland researcher Donal Patton, who outlines the current trial being carried out in Teagasc Ballyhaise, which looks specifically at transitioning to low chemical nitrogen perennial ryegrass white clover swards. So thanks for joining us, Donal. I suppose maybe to start, can you give us a bit of a background as to why the trial came about?
Yeah, so I suppose we had a long number of years of looking at grazing type studies in Ballyhaise, James, for 10 or 15 years prior to this study, and had looked at systems for farmers in the region where profitable grazing type systems where good profits could be returned, but the big Achilles heel, I suppose, was that it was all reliant on pretty high levels of chemical nitrogen to grow high levels of forage. That's basically what it was relied on. And looking forward and looking down the road, that's, from a regulatory point of view and from an environmental efficiency point of view, I suppose that was going to come into question. So we hadn't done much in terms of clover up until that point. So this was in sort of late 2020. And we sort of made the decision, right, this is something we need to do. We're probably slow out of the blocks in terms of establishing clover on the farm. We had very little done at that stage. And I suppose between the team, myself and Brendan Horn and a few of us sort of got together and said, well, sure, it's actually a positive that we don't have that much done, because we can look at the stuff that nobody else really has looked at yet, which is the effect on the overall system of this transition. So I suppose that's where we started from, James, was looking and saying, right, the big questions was, can we establish it on our soil type? We were pretty confident on big proportions of the farm. We could. Parts of it is always going to be a challenge because of heavier soils and flooding and issues like that. Getting it in is one thing. The persistence is the other thing. And I suppose the other big question is what's the effect on the overall farm feed budget, cow performance in that transition or messy phase of the whatever number of years to go from grass only swards to grass clover swards. So they were kind of the questions we were setting out to answer at the start.
How exactly then did you set the trial up?
Yeah, so I suppose at that stage, we had 52 hectares of a milking platform on the farm, running in around 140 cows. We'd divided it into two separate sward types, so grass only and then grass clover swards. As we started the trial, they were all, perennial ryegrass swards, as I said, getting high levels of chemical nitrogen. And originally our plan was to set out over a 5 to 6 year period to transition into grass clover swards. Actually, our steering committee met with us in August 2020, and they asked us to speed that process up. And I suppose it's just one important point. We were doing this very much so from a research point of view, and for the reason that the big questions were, establishment and persistency. So the more we got done quicker, the quicker we were going to be able to answer those questions. Now, we did measure the effects, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, I suppose, the effects that had of doing it so quickly. But that was the starting point, was to look at the transition, to look at the transition through from a grass sward to grass clover sward. And we just made the decision at the time, James, that we did the same levels of sward renewal or receding across both treatments. So the reason why we did that was to that we wouldn't end up in a situation where we were, at this stage now, 4 years down the road, comparing new grass clover swords to old grass only
So
swords.
so that's really
Yes,
to take any bias out of it, Donal, that
correct, correct.
no
So very
any
much so
yeah.
set up as from an experimental point of view. Some people I know with having groups of farmers coming in, they often question that. Sure, why did you do such a high level reseeding on the grass only swords? That was the main reason for that was that when we compare the swords and we show people the results, that there's no bias, as you say, in the things.
I suppose what's interesting, and I know the trial has got a lot of interest over the last number of years, is it's no different than the situation farmers are in the fact that there's a lot of farms with maybe not a lot of clover on them. And as you say, it's that transition process, albeit at a slower rate at commercial farm level. But the success of that establishment process to date, I suppose, we're into year 4. So that kind of 3-year transition, has every paddock got clover at this stage in terms or an attempt to establish clover, and how has that went?
Yeah, so the word there was attempt, I suppose, and that was the starting point. So we attempted every area within our grass clover treatments we've made attempts and been fairly successful on big proportions of it. And I suppose the breakdown of that now, Helena Walsh is our PhD student at John Joe Collins, the farm manager. They're doing a huge amount of measuring, looking at the clover content. So and that's cutting and separating. It's not visual stuff, so we can be very confident in the figures, I suppose. So look at as an overall, people ask that, and this is part of the reason why we did it this way was to start answering those questions over oversowing and reseeding. And people ask which is the better method, and the answer is, as always is the case in these things, it's complicated. It's there's the both of their strengths and the both of their weaknesses. So if we take reseeding first, probably the best way of looking at it, we'll just look at the reseeding. So that's burning the existing sward off and putting in a new sward, James. So what did we find by doing that? We got really good establishment. The average over the 3 years was 30% clover content, which is, on or slightly above the target. So really good establishment. We had good quality swards after doing it, no problem grazing out. So that was the positives, and that's it. The negatives, and it's even bigger or exacerbated more the fact we tried to do so much within each year, was the effect that it had on the overall feed budget on the farm. So by reseeding, we actually, the long-term average of Ballyhaise is around about 14 tonne. When we split it out, and Helena's done this work, she went back and she looked at in year 1 or establishment year of the sward, the full first year of production, the second year of production. So basically, in the establishment year, we were losing around about 5 tonnes dry matter per hectare in the reseeding. Why was that? The main reason for that was that the period of time that it was out of production, so between the last grazing of the old sward and the first grazing of the new sward, was longer than what we would have planned, through weather conditions or missing windows of opportunity to get work done or whatever. But it ended up, a longer period than what we would have planned for. And that was across the 3 years. And that resulted in a big, big impact. As I say, a 5 tonne drop across that area, which if you added up, 25% of our area was losing 5 tonne. That was about 2 tonne across the overall farm or thereabouts. We would have dropped from growing 14 to 2 tonne. So that's a big impact. Now, the oversowing, less successful from a clover establishment point of view. 14% clover content was the average across those swards. And I suppose the big thing, that's one thing, definitely from a clover establishment point of view, less successful, but it was lower risk. So lower cost process, number 1. Number 2, the area wasn't out. And number 3, in year 1 or in the establishment year, you did take a hit, but you took much less of a hit. But the reductions in we're not achieving the reductions in chemical nitrogen, James, on those swards, if you look at them overall, because there's not enough clover there to carry it. So
And
Yeah,
was
the
that
receding,
was that
I
specific,
suppose.
Donal, in terms of the failure? We'll say, was there paddocks that just failed and there was oversold paddocks that
Look,
worked
there
well, or
was, yes, there was paddocks that just completely did nothing, and I think anyone who's done a lot of overzone will tell you that you know there's a percentage of paddocks will do, but even the ones where we were quote unquote successful, you know, getting Clover in there, there's still the ones that are always on the line, James. You know what I mean, in terms of is there enough, is there not enough type of thing. So, and it's probably when I wouldn't have had much experience of this before we done this trial, and I kept sort of thinking and looking at it and saying it's a lot to expect this little clover plant to be able to compete in a established grass sward. That's not to say it's impossible. It's also not to say that we did everything during that process perfectly, because we didn't. So I suppose there is guys out there. I know some commercial farmers doing it and getting on really well with it, and I think it does have a role to play. There's a role to play on with guys who are heavy stocking rates and milking platforms, can't afford to be taking out big percentage of their areas. Recent new entrants, I think, could have a role to play because they've got relatively new swards, James, and open swards. I think that there's places like that where I think the oversowing has a role to play. So that's why I suppose it's a long way of answering your
yeah.
question, but
No, but
I don't want
even
people to go sort of come and say, right, oh, well, sure, the receding is the only job, or the
yeah.
oversowing the only job. I think the reality of the situation is that you'll use a bit of those tools. The important thing is to understand where are the places that you use each of them. That's the important thing.
Yeah. And look, I suppose the big thing, Donal, is most people would be doing maybe 10% receding a year.
Right.
Get that right. And
Correct.
the oversowing may be another paddock or two, or it may
Yes.
be, as you said to me, topping up where content is a little lower than you'd like,
Yes.
oversow to top up or something like that. Just
100%.
one more question for you on the whole establishment side of things. The accelerated approach, you did say that's probably not something you'd be doing at commercial farm level, but you wanted the answers, and the steering committee were dead right to get the answers a lot quicker for our commercial farmer listeners. But what has been the impact to that, maybe before we go on to performance to date?
Yeah, so the accelerated sward renewal, maybe it's another element of this trial that might be a bit different than other stuff that's been done before. And it's a real testament to these systems type studies. Like, and I always say this to people: there's no hiding place. Like whatever we do, we run it. We try to run it as best we can, day to day, week to week. But if there's big gaps in what we're doing, it will show up. It'll show up somewhere. It'll show up in the annual performance or the feed budget or whatever. And in this case, it showed up very much showing the feed budget. So basically, over that 3 year period of trying to establish the area that we would normally close up for silage on our platform, we were basically receding. So effectively, it ended up that at 2.5 cows to the hectare whole farm stocking rate, we were only making 55% of our winter feed, James, which if you go back and look at our figures from, traditionally at that stocking rate would be, 80, 90% self-sufficient, at that level. So that's the basic effect it had. We still endeavored every week, every day and every week to try and feed the herd as best we possibly could. And by doing that, it basically meant that we just didn't make enough winter feed in the system. So obviously that's not commercially doable for most people, or even near it. Might suit somebody who's got a new portion of land, or the stocking rate's low or whatever. But it is a great result of the trial to have that to show people, look, if you're trying to do this, accelerated, or, once you go above the 10% receding, you need to have a plan. You need to have excess winter feed. You need to have a lower stocking rate, extra land, whatever. But trying to do it in a situation where the system is pretty balanced, it's going to cost a huge amount of money, basically, to replace that winter feed. So it's not a positive from the trial, but it is a positive in that we've identified that and the other one there that you need, I suppose I need to hit on the head, is that was a receding effect. It was not a clover reduction in nitrogen effect, because the great thing about doing exactly the same thing with our grass and our clover swards is that we've seen exactly the same. So I think our grass swards was 55% self-sufficient, and our clover swards were 56% self-sufficient. So it was a receding effect. It was the fact that we did so much receding. It was nothing to do with the clover reduction in nitrogen thing.
I'm not going to get into the management of those established swards because it's been well covered how you manage newly reseeds. But maybe the management now of your grass clover swards and your fertilizer strategy specifically.
Yeah, so look at the fertilizer strategy. We started off kind of with this in our head, and we've continued it through because in Ballyhaise we've always been tight for grass in spring. It's a slower farm to kick off. That it would be definitely behind in terms of, if you compare us to Moor Park, would be behind in terms of grass, having enough grass in spring. So look, we still wanted to be, a grazing farm, to have the cows, get them out as early as we can, keep them out and all the rest of it. So I suppose we've said at the start we're going to use nitrogen. Our aim at the beginning, James, was to halve the rate of nitrogen. So at the time that was 250 kilos of chemical N, getting it back down to 125. But we front load that in on our clover sward. So basically, nitrogen strategy is if there's enough clover in the sward, it's getting first 2 rounds of nitrogen as normal. And then after that, it's not getting anything. If there's not enough clover in it to carry us, we will put on, either half rate or full rate nitrogen, depending on how poor it is. And yeah, I suppose that's it. So there's a good percentage of the farm, there's sort of 55% or 60%, I think Alina counted up from 2023, that the clover contents were good enough to pull nitrogen or pull the nitrogen, from basically April, May onwards. Now, this year was a little bit different because of the way the year went, and it was slow to get going, and couldn't get out early enough. Like it was into May when we were still putting on nitrogen on those in May, but it's worked out about the same. I was looking at it this morning, it's around about 100 kilos of nitrogen, on those treatments that they've got to date. So a bit more will go on that because there's a percentage of the farm that there's not enough in it to carry us. So that, we probably will end up around that 120.
I was just going to ask that question in terms of clover contents. It's something farmers are bringing up, Donal, this year to say maybe paddocks that had adequate clover contents last year and have fell back a little bit. Now, I think that is changing on farms over the last couple of weeks. Clover does seem to be improving on farms, but is that something you have seen yourselves, or how are the clover
Yeah, well,
contents?
look, just walking around, I would have thought that it is back a little bit. Again, Alina was doing up the figures, and she said last week, I think we are, 5 or 6% behind where we were last year, like at this stage. Similar to yourself, I would say it is starting to, it has improved, but we've gone through like a really bad back end last year, summer and back end. We've gone through a horrendous spring. We had 2 weeks of phenomenal growth, and then it's kind of gone back and flatlined again. We're sort of sitting between 40 and 60 there the last couple of weeks. So, yeah, at the minute you'll be questioning on some, is there enough? I think there is, and one of the big things, and it's people who are at it a lot longer than me would have said it to me, keep an eye on the distribution as much as the percentage. As in, if there's clover everywhere you put your foot down, you're pretty sure that when the conditions come right, it will kick off. And that kind of makes sense to me, or that over the last couple of years looking at it, that's how I feel about it, or looking at it, that if there's clover there everywhere, even if the percentage is back a little bit where you'd like it to be, the infrastructure is there under the ground, the stolons are there, and it will kick off when the conditions are right for it to do so.
Yeah, you'd be saying it really has been up to now a growth conditions effect as much as on.
Well, look, that's my thinking of it at the minute. Parts of the farm, are good, very good. Other parts, not so much. Another thing, I suppose, that we found is the cutting. Going in and cutting swards. Going in and cutting swards really, really improves it. So, I was talking to John this morning, he reckons in and around about 65-70% of the area has got a blade at this stage of the game. So that definitely will help. And that was one of the one of the hidden things, and that's what I mean about no hiding place. There was one of the hidden things about the way we ran the system for the last 3 years. So basically, pulling out 25% of the area, stocking rates were up close to 4 livestock units per hectare. Essentially, for that period of time, there was no option to take much. Very little surplus was taken, and I think that left it harder to get the clover contents up, if you know what I'm saying. So our approach this year was we did close up some silage. We sort of pushed stocking rate up to 3.2 or 3.2 or 3. That was caught early in May. So everything is back open to us and we're taking the surplus as it comes. And the plan or the hope is, James, that will help us big time in terms of clover content, because we'll get to cut everything early on in the year, not cutting it in August like we're cutting it, May, June, July. So hopefully that'll kick it on too. Definitely, looking at it over the last 3 or 4 years of doing it, anything that gets cut, you can just see it in the following rotation. It just really kicks on. But the infrastructure has to be there at soil level first for that to happen. That's why I'm saying about the distribution. If you've only got clumps here and clumps there, it doesn't matter if you cut it. They're oversown, and you have to go in and oversow them to try and kick them on.
Sward productivity, Donal. How grass
so
versus
look,
grass clover? How have they been performing?
Yeah, as I was saying to you yesterday, the day before, like we have the luxury. So one of the good things about working in research is you have the luxury of patience and being able to let things go through the course. So basically, when Alina pulled that stuff off and she looked at it, she basically, by year 2, so an establishment year across the board, productivity dropped hugely, like 5 ton from 14 down to 9 or thereabouts ton. By year 2, boom, back up, straight back up. Grass swards growing just over 14 ton, 225 kilos of chemical in. Clover swards growing the same with in around 85, I think it was, kilos, 90 kilos chemical in. Year 3, or so second full year production trend is very similar. So they're doing the business in terms of growing the tonnage with 150 kilos less nitrogen, which, to be honest with you, at the beginning of the trial I wouldn't have expected that, but that's because the establishment has been good.
I was just going to say, you've answered some of those questions we spoke about at the start in terms of the establishment question. Has been pretty good, and obviously now in terms of sward productivity, looks good as well.
Well, you mentioned it there, James, and we maybe skipped over it a little bit, but it's a really important one for people to understand. We went into swards that were doing 14 ton. Why were they doing 14 ton? Well, they were getting the nitrogen, but the P's, K's, and pH were very, very good, or excellent, basically. So we went in, we burned off productive swards, we put in grass clover swards, and okay, we took a hit in year 1, but year 2 and 3, off we went. At farm level, lads are going into swards that are maybe not producing enough, and it could be an underlying drainage or soil fertility issue or whatever it is. They're putting in clover swards and maybe disappointed with how they're doing. Then they're blaming clover and nitrogen and whatever, and that might be the case in some cases, but it's two different things. It's two completely different things. If you're going in and doing productive, land that's in good shape and productive, putting in clover swards, you'd be reasonably confident that they'll be able to do the business. If you're going in with the pH is low or the P is low or whatever, the chances clover is way more sensitive to that sort of stuff. So you're going to get a not as good a result, I suppose.
Yeah, and in terms the last question maybe there is the animal performance question. Then I know there's been this transition phase, and you're probably at the stage now where there's a high percentage of the farm in grass clover now, so maybe you'll see it more going forward. But have you seen an animal performance difference?
No, the performances in terms of, the results in terms of animal performance, look, it's tending towards a higher, production on the clover swards, but it's very small. It's something like 465 to 470 kilos of solids. So it's around about 5 to 10 kilos of solids, which is, it's not significant. There's a sort of a tendency, James. So, effectively there's no difference. And I wouldn't have expected there to be, because in year one, when we started in our clover treatments, it was probably July time before they ate a paddock of clover. And that was only over a percentage of the farm, and same in year two and same in year three. So yeah, it'll be this year forward that we'll see that. I haven't looked at it in a while, but it'll be interesting to see from this year forward. So this is the full first settled year, we'll say, where there's not huge amounts of reseeding being done or any of that sort of stuff. So looking at other trials, they're sort of showing that boost in animal performance, but essentially across the transition phase, we haven't got that. So we have big costs in terms of the establishment. We have big costs in terms of replacing the winter feed, and we didn't get any extra milk. So it's from an economics point of view. That's why I'm saying what we did, you just wouldn't do at commercial farm level.
One concern which we can't talk about clover without having a conversation around it is obviously managing bloat. And it's probably one of the bigger barriers, Donal, at commercial farm level
Yeah.
in terms of the adoption of this technology. How exactly have you managed that? Like you're talking about clover contents there on average at 30% in your reseeds. So in the tail end of the year, they're going to be very,
Yeah.
very high clover content. How are you managing that?
The peaked out at on average over the 3 years, 38%, but now to be products within that will be up at the 50 and 60%, the other one's lower. So how did you manage that? I suppose, well, sure, it was Barry in the first couple of years, Barry Riley, and then John Joe last year, really, that was doing the management of it day to day. The big thing, I suppose, is awareness of it. That's the biggest thing, just to be thinking about it and be aware of it. Our approach from the start has been belt and braces type of approach, to be honest, James, in that we do whatever we have to do to try and avoid the risk. So the risks is, lush sward. So, maybe after grass after being cut, high clover contents, damp, wet weather. So last year was a pretty high risk year now, to be honest with you, last summer, because we were having deluges of rain. So bloat oil went in from probably, I'm not just 100% sure, but probably late July, early August on. Bloat oil was going in to the clover groups. 12-hour wires probably a month earlier than you would in your grass swards. So generally speaking, on grass swards, it's sort of mid-September when those pre-grazing yields are getting high. We go in our 12-hour wires. It's probably mid-August last year when we went in with those. And then during real high-risk periods where if John Joe was afraid that even doing all that, there's still that risk there, he was putting in a little bit of fibre into the diet, straw basically in the collecting yard. It wasn't much, but because we're nipping at it on the way past. And farmers have asked me, which of those 3 or 4 things is the most important? And I've always said, well, that's not our trial. Like, we're looking at the establishment in clover, and we're just doing what we can do to avoid bloat issues. Now, we had one incidence of bloat last year, but it was a cow. It was actually on a reseeded sward, first grazing after reseeding. There wasn't that high a clover content in it. And we had one this year. We didn't have to do it. The one last year had to get veterinary attention. This year, she just kind of worked herself out of it. So yeah, it's just something we have to be watching and be careful of. But I can understand that farmers are nervous of it. I can 100% understand that. But
it's
if you're doing all those things,
if
you're doing all those, isn't it? Yeah, if you're doing all those things, there's never no risk. There's never no risk, but the risk is much, much, much less.
The final thing is you do have an open day coming up in Ballyhaise.
Yeah.
Just a comment on that. When is it? And
so it's on the 24th of July, James. So we had one 2 years ago where we were in the early stages, or we were only in year 2 of the trial. So we have a good bit of information gathered now at this stage across the transition phase. So we'll be highlighting that and having a discussion and see what farmers think. And I suppose we'll be getting a bit of feedback, as usually is the case on these days. We also have a few people speaking then on general issues like herd genetics, financial situation on farms, and a few other bits and pieces like that. And then we have an indoor session where we're talking to 2 young couples from the region who've got into farming. One is a family farm, situation, and the other is share milk or young pups or share milk in County Roscommon. So I suppose it's just looking at the routes in for young people. We need more and more young people to be getting into the industry. So, having that sort of a bit of a discussion around that and what their experience is. So.
Yep, as always, it's a good day, and thank you, Donal, for obviously giving us an update with where the trial's at. But as you say, come along to the open day, and you'll get to see it for yourself. So that's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, folks. My thanks to Donal Patton for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm James Dunne, and join us next time for your Dairy Edge.